That night was supposed to celebrate our love, but I wasn't ready for the words that would destroy everything I believed about my marriage. I had no idea that this table, set with such care, would be remembered not for love, but for what it revealed. I'd even put on the pearl earrings from our 10th anniversary. I was a woman preparing to celebrate the greatest love story of her life. When Marcus stumbled through the front door 40 minutes late, his appearance hit me like ice water thrown in my face. His usually pristine suit was wrinkled and stained, but it was his eyes that made my blood freeze, wild and unguarded, and filled with something I'd never seen before. Something that looked almost like hatred. He stared at my carefully set table with an expression I couldn't read, his gaze moving from the flickering candles to the unopened anniversary card I'd placed beside his plate. Then he laughed, a sound so foreign and cruel that it made every nerve in my body recoil. My heart began to pound against my ribs as I watched him walk unsteadily to the kitchen counter and pour himself a drink from a bottle I hadn't seen him bring in. "Emma," he said, turning to face me with that same terrifying laugh still echoing in his voice, "do you ever wonder why I married you?" The question landed like a physical blow to my chest. In 35 years of marriage, through raising 3 children and burying both sets of parents and weathering every storm life had thrown at us, I had never once questioned the foundation of our love. How could I? We'd built a life together, a family, a legacy, because I believed it was love. I believed it was real and pure and chosen. My throat closed as I watched him take a long, deliberate sip of whatever poison he was drinking. There was a pause before his next words that felt heavier than anything he had already said. His eyes never left my face, and there was something predatory in his gaze that made me want to run from my own dining room. Something in his expression told me this night would not end the way I had imagined. "You want to know something, Emma?" he continued, his voice growing softer and more dangerous with each word. "I loved Susan first." The words hit me like bullets fired at close range. "Your sister Susan," he continued, savoring each syllable like fine wine. God, how I loved that woman. The room tilted sideways, the carefully arranged flowers blurred through tears I hadn't even realized were falling. Susan, my younger sister with her wild ambition and infectious laugh, who'd left for London when we were both young women, with the whole world spread out before us like an unmarked map. My legs gave out completely, and I gripped the back of my dining room chair so hard that my knuckles turned white and my wedding ring cut into my finger. 35 years of marriage suddenly rearranged themselves in my mind like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle I'd been putting together wrong my entire life. Marcus kept talking, his voice growing stronger and more vicious with each revelation. He told me about secret meetings in coffee shops downtown while I was at work, believing I was married to a man who was building a business to support our growing family. Love letters hidden in books at the public library, a clandestine correspondence that flourished under my completely unsuspecting nose. Promises made in shadowy corners of restaurants I'd never heard of, pledges of eternal devotion whispered in parking lots and park benches while I was home preparing dinner for a man I thought was working late for our future. "When she left me," he said, his voice cracking with pain that was 40 years old but still fresh enough to bleed. "When she chose her career and that life in London over me, I thought I would die. I thought the world had actually ended." He took another drink, longer this time, as if he was trying to wash away the taste of old heartbreak. And then I realized something beautiful. Emma. I realized that the perfect revenge would be to marry her sister. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process that my entire adult life, every moment of happiness, every shared laugh, every intimate touch, every child we'd created together, had been nothing more than an elaborate form of vengeance against the woman I'd loved most in the world. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" he asked, his eyes bright with malicious satisfaction. "Every time she called to check on you, every time she sent birthday gifts for the kids, every time she came home for the holidays, she had to see what she'd given up. She had to see me happy with her own sister. She had to watch me build the exact life she'd rejected, but with you instead of her." The realization crashed over me like a wave, drowning me in the sudden understanding that I had spent 4 decades living as someone's second choice, someone's consolation prize, someone's weapon against the woman who'd had the strength to follow her own dreams. I realized I wasn't uncovering a single secret, but an entire life built beside the truth. The way conversations stopped when I walked into rooms during family gatherings, the careful way my parents spoke about Susan when Marcus was around, the strange tension that always seemed to fill our house whenever my sister called. Marcus was still talking, but his voice had changed again, becoming smaller and more frightened as he seemed to realize what he'd done. He was stammering apologies, blaming the alcohol, trying to convince me that none of it mattered anymore, because look what we'd built together. Look at our beautiful children. Look at the life we'd created that was real, regardless of how it had begun. But I was already walking away from the table, leaving the anniversary dinner I'd prepared with such hope and love, leaving the man who'd just revealed that our entire marriage had been an elaborate performance designed to hurt the woman I'd spent 35 years missing, without even understanding why. I walked past the flickering candles that now seemed to be mocking me with their romantic glow, past the anniversary card that would remain forever unread. I walked out of the dining room and into my sewing room, where I spent the rest of the night surrounded by quilts I'd made during countless lonely evenings when Marcus worked late or traveled for business. As I sat in the darkness, my hands moving automatically over the fabric I'd been piecing together for months, I began to remember things differently. The way he sometimes called me Susan in his sleep, the way he stiffened whenever she sent photographs of her life in London, the way he'd always found reasons to be somewhere else whenever she visited. I had been so busy being grateful for his love that I'd never noticed he was only giving me the scraps left over after he'd fed his true devotion to my sister's memory. When morning came, gray and merciless through my sewing room window, I called Susan for the first time in almost 3 years. Her voice sounded older than I remembered, more fragile, but when I said Marcus's name, there was a sharp intake of breath that told me everything I needed to know. She spoke carefully, choosing each word like someone walking through a field of landmines, but the truth came out in fragments that cut me deeper with each revelation. Yes, there had been something between them when we were all young. Yes, it had been serious enough that she'd considered staying in America. No, she'd had no idea about his plan to marry me as some kind of twisted consolation prize. She cried when I told her what he'd revealed the night before. Cried for me, for the years I'd lost, for the love I'd given so freely to a man who'd been using me as a way to stay connected to her. Cried for herself, for carrying the guilt of a choice she'd made in innocence, never knowing the destruction it would cause in its wake. When I finally hung up the phone, I sat in my kitchen staring at my hands, these 65-year-old hands that had prepared thousands of meals for a man who was dreaming of my sister while he ate them, hands that had touched and comforted for our entire marriage. Marcus appeared in the kitchen sometime after noon, freshly showered and dressed in clean clothes, looking like the man I thought I'd known for 35 years. His eyes were clear now, focused, and there was something almost cheerful about his demeanor as he poured himself coffee and asked if I was feeling better today. He claimed he remembered nothing about the previous evening, nothing about the words that had shattered my understanding of our entire life together. Perhaps we could try the dinner again tonight, he suggested. Start fresh, make new memories. I told him exactly what he had revealed, word for word, watching his face change from confusion to horror to desperate denial as the magnitude of his drunken confession hit him. He tried to take it back, to minimize it, to frame it as ancient history that had no bearing on the beautiful life we'd built together. He reminded me of our children's love, our grandchildren's laughter, the way we finished each other's sentences after all these years. All of it was real. He insisted, all of it mattered more than what had happened 40 years ago between two foolish young people who didn't know what they wanted. But I could no longer tell where his genuine feelings ended and his performance began. I could no longer trust that any moment of tenderness or passion or simple companionship between us had been freely given, rather than carefully calculated to maintain the illusion he'd created. How do you stay married to someone when you discover that your entire relationship has been a 40-year-long lie? By then, I already knew staying would cost me more than leaving ever could. 3 weeks later, over morning coffee in our sunny kitchen, while the autumn light slanted through windows, I dressed with curtains I'd sewn myself. I told Marcus I wanted a separation. He argued with the same logical precision he'd always brought to difficult decisions. Our age, our financial entanglement, what people would think. He reminded me of our children's upcoming weddings, our plans for retirement, the life insurance policies and investment accounts we'd built together. Everything he said was reasonable and practical and completely beside the point. The point was that I could no longer bear to live as someone else's consolation prize, no matter how comfortable the prize might be. I could no longer pretend that a love built on deception was the same as real love. I could no longer look at myself in the mirror and see anything other than a woman who'd been fooled for 35 years. I filed for divorce on a Thursday morning in October, when the maple tree in our front yard was blazing gold like a torch against the autumn sky. The papers felt thin and insignificant in my hands, nothing like the magnitude of what they represented. Marcus moved out the following weekend, taking only his personal belongings and a few pieces of furniture that held no particular memories for either of us. Our children were devastated and confused, unable to understand why their parents were dissolving a marriage that had seemed solid and loving from the outside. They worried about my finances, my loneliness, my ability to build a new life when most people my age were settling deeper into the lives they'd already built. But as the weeks passed and I settled into my quiet apartment across town, surrounded by my quilts and books and the profound silence of complete authenticity, I discovered something I'd forgotten existed: peace. Not the peace of resignation or compromise or making the best of a difficult situation, but the peace that comes from finally telling the truth about your own life. The peace of a woman who'd stopped pretending that someone else's leftover affection was enough to sustain her spirit. In the evenings, when I sit in my living room with tea and a book, listening to nothing but the sound of my own breathing, I feel something I hadn't experienced in decades. I feel like myself, completely and authentically myself, unmarked by the weight of someone else's unfinished story, no longer wondering why certain conversations fell silent when I entered a room, or why my husband's eyes sometimes seemed to be looking past me toward something I couldn't see. At 65, I'm finally learning to love the woman I might have been if I'd known the truth from the beginning. The woman I am now, filling her days with intentions that belong entirely to her own unmanipulated heart. The woman who chose truth over comfort, herself over a beautiful lie, the woman who is finally, completely, and authentically free.